Following a car accident on Tuesday afternoon, the Panthers announced on Wednesday that Andy Dalton will not start for the team in Denver. Instead, it will be Bryce Young. And based off of where the Panthers are at and how they performed recently, should the Panthers stick with Bryce moving forward? I answered that question among other listener questions on this weekly Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for watching the show here on YouTube and wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Be sure to follow me, Julian Council, on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Wednesday throughout the entirety of the regular season, like today, I'm here answering your weekly Wednesday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council to get those questions in for next week's edition of the weekly Wednesday mailbag right here on Locked On Panthers. Today's episode of Locked On Panthers is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. And before we get started today with our mailbag questions, one question asking about the quarterback situation moving forward here in Carolina. Big update as we saw on Tuesday. Andy Dalton, his wife, his 3 children, and their dog were involved in a car accident in Charlotte. The good thing is no one was transported to the hospital. They were all fine, able to leave the scene, go back home, and be safe, which is obviously the most important news. Wasn't surprising, though, on Wednesday to see that Andy Dalton was not out there on the practice field after being in a car accident the day prior. The news that we did get from Dave Canales is that Andy Dalton sustained an injury to his right thumb, meaning he will not start on Sunday. Instead, it will be Bryce Young, who started the first 2 games in New Orleans at home against Los Angeles before being benched in favor for Andy Dalton over the last couple of weeks. So unfortunate for Andy that he will not be able to play after the car accident, but great news that it's not as serious as car accidents obviously can be, in that he will be back at some point in time, it appears, here in Carolina, as he's now being evaluated day to day. But at least for 1 week in Denver, it's going to be Bryce Young's job to be the quarterback, and we'll see if he has sat back, he's watched, he's learned, and he's improved in the short little stints he's had this past Sunday in Washington and a couple weeks ago in Chicago as well. We'll see how he plays on Sunday afternoon. Now, going over to the mailbag, got Chris, who's asking a question that pertains to the Panthers quarterback situation. He asked me this before we even got the news about Andy Dalton. Then we got the news even today on Wednesday about Bryce being able to start. He asked, I hate hindsight questions, but with the current sentiment in the locker room, the blowouts, do you think it was a mistake to bench Bryce? It was great to witness the Raiders game and see the offense function, but as you said, the offense must play a nearly flawless game in order to win, and this team is bad. Now, with the locker room appearing to lose faith once again, perhaps we should have stuck with Young and potentially see where that would have went. Maybe there would be a get-right game for him, just like Andy's Raiders game. It's not like Bryce's trade stock could get much lower, barring an injury, and Dalton isn't looking to be the bridge we're all hoping for. I know it's still early, and we will get to see Young play. Dalton could light it up again. In all honesty, he's fine. None of this seems to answer any long-term questions, though. The Panthers seem to try everything but be consistent on a week-to-week basis. Well, one guy who actually has tried to be consistent on a week-to-week basis has been Dave Canales, where he's been asked pretty much every week, are you going to go back to Bryce or are you going to stick with Andy? And he said, no, we are sticking with Andy. This is the best thing for the team. I want to build what we have here this season with Andy Dalton. He said that multiple times on Monday following the loss against Washington, that Andy Dalton would start. Now, he did not, of course, know that Andy Dalton would get in a car accident on Thursday, that he would hurt his thumb, and that Bryce Young then on Wednesday would be the named starter, at least for this week in Denver. But he's been the one person consistent since they made the switch that Andy Dalton is his guy. And unless there was an injury, like with the car accident, he was going to continue to be his guy, and we'll see after this game whether Bryce plays well or doesn't play well or is just okay, whether Andy Dalton will still be his guy. And I kind of feel like he will, just be based on everything that we have seen and heard Dave Canales do so far this season. Now, Diana Rossini put this out there Dan Orsini, formerly ESPN, now The Athletic, she did put this out there about Bryce Young starting, saying, I've been asked around the league what the Panthers should do with Bryce Young. Most believe they need to get him really prepared at practice and put him in a few games, helps his value. So if they decide they want to trade him, they can get the best compensation. Now, going back to your question overall, Chris, as far as whether the Panthers pull the plug too soon, like I was pretty adamant back at the beginning of the season that I did not feel like the Panthers should sit Bryce Young. Now, I said even before they did it that going to Andy Dalton did nothing for the organization. And what did I mean by that? Because this was never going to be a playoff team. We have seen how poorly this defense has played with the injuries and even before that. But prior to that, I felt back in the summer this was not going to be a good defensive unit. I had a lot of questions, even offensively, aside from the offensive line of, do you have enough playmakers on the outside? And are you going to be able to run the ball consistently enough to take the pressure off of Bryce, whoever is going to be the quarterback this season? So I never felt like this was going to be a playoff team. Dalton turns 37 next week. He was never going to be the long-term answer at the position. And at best, he could be a bridge through 2025. They punted on Bryce too early, in my opinion. And I get it. He was awful against the Orleans. He was awful against the Chargers, and I did not defend his play. I looked at the receiver separation stats. I looked at the offensive line, and clearly the problem week 1 and week 2 was Bryce Young. And I sat here and I said that. But I also said they just got to stick through it, man. You did not bring Dave Canales in. You did not bring all these players offensively on the line and at receiver, make the decisions there in the draft to then bail after 2 weeks. Like, it did not make sense from the outside why they would do that, aside from, yes, he was not playing well. Now, understand this. If Bryce kept playing poorly, they were going to have to sit him down at some point in time. But also, what we saw in Vegas when Andy Dalton came in was a brand new energy from this team. It felt much like the Arizona game when Cam Newton told us that he was back. Now, Andy Dalton, Cam Newton, completely different situations, different players, understand all of that. The team seemed to believe in Andy. The team, even though they voted for Bryce to be a captain, did not appear that they truly believed in Bryce. How do you know that? Adam Thielen is having a meltdown week 2 of the season because he was wide open and trying to say, no, I'm not mad at Bryce. It's not about Bryce. Yes, it was about Bryce. And all that we saw offensively and the energy and the renewed hope was about Bryce just not being very good for the Panthers. So I just felt like for an organization to bail on a quarterback 18 games in after all they gave up for him just did not make a lot of sense. And I just don't know how you can properly evaluate. And I get it. He wasn't great in those 18 games. Man, last season was a complete train wreck. How can you sit here and really judge this guy based off an offensive line that had constant injuries, receivers outside of Adam Thielen, who was 33 years old, who could not get open, an inconsistent run game, and just a defense decimated by injuries, but still a defense that gave the offense more opportunities and the defense had opportunities, vice versa, as far as complementary football goes. I did not like the decision. And sitting here, even after watching everything go on, like, it's hard to argue from the team perspective that Dave Canales did not make the right decision for the Carolina Panthers, but organizationally, did they make the right decision by moving on from Bryce Young at that point in time? Hard to say yes to that, as they still don't know. And maybe they do know. Maybe you know, maybe I know that after 18 games that this is not going to be the guy. But there's 16 of them that were royally effed up, and 2 of them where he clearly offensively was a problem. Meanwhile, the defense also was terrible, but people wanted to ignore how bad they were. And now we sit here after a 1-6 start and know, oh yeah, defense also stinks. So maybe it wasn't just a quarterback change that was going to fix things. Like I tried to tell y'all, even after Dalton came in and they lit up the Raiders and before that. So the Panthers are going to have to live with their decision, and they made it. They wanted to bench Bryce. Canales, at the very least, did. He was not here when they made all those decisions to trade up to get Bryce Young, give up DJ Moore, and even before that, trading away Christian McCaffrey and using some of that compensation they got from San Francisco in the effort to move up to number 1 with Chicago to get Bryce Young. They're going to deal with the consequences. And in all likelihood, like I've been saying for a while now, Bryce Young is going to get traded. The Niners moved on for Trey Lance. The Jets moved on from Zach Wilson. The Pats moved on from Mac Jones. the Panthers will likely move on from Bryce Young. And the expectation is they will move on. The rest of the league, according to Diana Rossetti, wants to see Bryce Young play and see what he's actually worth and if he's gotten better or if it's all in Carolina. But the reports also came out that Bryce was ticked off about this move, and that was a relationship that was going to be forever altered by this decision. So I wonder if feasibly they can move on after they bench Bryce. Now they go back to him, and will they stick with him? I don't know. I feel like at some point in time, they needed to go back to him just to make sure. But even then, it still felt like making sure would be, hey, NFL, look what he can do, and then actually moving on at the end of the day. When you make that decision, you sideline him. Even if he was the problem offensively, it's really hard to go back unless a scenario comes up like the one we have now, where Andy Dalton hurts his thumb, and now Bryce gets another opportunity. And if he plays bad again, it'll be Andy there, and it may be Andy the rest of the season. We'll find out, but it is an interesting conversation that's going to be had throughout the rest of the week here on the show and throughout Carolina, and we'll see on Sunday. It makes me a lot more excited about watching this game. 1-6 of Andy Dalton playing, where there's no future of Andy Dalton being here in Carolina as the long-term option. It's just another game where we're sitting here just twiddling our thumbs and wondering when a trade's going to be made prior to the deadline. Now Bryce back in there, that opens the possibility to Bryce playing well. The Panthers still not turning a season around, of course. The season's lost, but it could be now more about developing their quarterback and seeing if he can build around him with the guys that he brought in, like Leggett and Coker and the rest of this young offense. So we'll see how it plays out. But yeah, I never felt like they should have gone away from Bryce Young that early after 4 weeks. Had he kept playing like that, yes, would have made sense. You have to do that for the sake of the team. But their sanity has not appeared to get any better, as they sit here at 1-6. And the offense has also put up clunkers on the road against Washington and on the road against Chicago and looked kind of like the same team we saw week 1 and week 2 when Bryce Young was out there. So we'll see how it plays out. Bryce Young will start on Sunday, as Andy Dalton will miss the game with a right thumb injury after being in a car accident on Tuesday. And thank God Andy's okay. Thank God his wife's okay. His kids are okay. And of course, their pup is okay. And we'll maybe see him next week, but that's all determined upon whether Canales wants to see him next week. And if Bryce Young goes out there and balls out against Denver, or if he plays terrible. So speaking of a trade deadline, we saw another trade happening. When it comes to wide receivers, DeAndre Hopkins is going to the Kansas City Chiefs. And I had a question coming up about, do the Panthers really need to make a trade now? Couldn't they just wait to get the comp picks in a couple of years? We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. Football season is back, and the best way to get to games this fall is with Game Time. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Game Time Picks curation makes it easier to say more on sports, comedy, theater, etc. Get a panoramic view from the seat in the app before you buy. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. Prize Picks is the best way to get action on sports in over 30 states, including California, Florida, Georgia, Texas, and of course here in the old North state of North Carolina. Sign up today and get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. Prize Picks is the best way to win real money this football season. Which players are going off, which ones aren't. Make your picks in less than 60 seconds and turn your sports opinions into real money all season long on Prize Picks. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. Back here on Locked On Panthers Weekly Wednesday mailbag, either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council to get your questions in for next week's edition of the show. The Carolina Panthers and the rest of the NFL counting down the days to the November 5th trade deadline, 4 p.m. Eastern time. On that day is the true deadline for the Panthers and the rest of the league. Talked about it on yesterday's show. Team's 1-6. They have some players that are assets like Deontay Johnson, Miles Sanders, and even Jonathan Mingo that they should probably move on from to get some actual draft assets and completely start rebuilding this team via the draft in 2025. So that's where I stand. But David isn't necessarily on board with that, saying, my question is, I get wanting to get value for our players at the trade deadline, but what is the point in moving them during the season if we can hang on to them for the rest of the season and they sign somewhere else? Don't we get a compensatory pick? This is what good teams like the Ravens do. If we can't get anything better than what a comp pick is, then just keep them and let them walk in free agency, which, sure, valid argument there. The Panthers have not received a compensatory pick since 2021. The last time before that was back in 2019 because Andrew Norwell decided to go sign with the Jacksonville Jaguars. Panthers currently have 30 players on the roster, according to Over the Cap, that are set to be free agents this offseason, which is a decent amount. But understand this, not every single player who's a free agent is going to be eligible to count towards the compensatory pick formula. CFAs, that's compensatory free agents. They are unrestricted free agents who have signed with a new team and are ranked in the top 35% of all NFL players. The NFL's Management Council uses a proprietary formula to determine a CFA's ranking, which considers factors like salary, playing time, and awards and honors. So top 35% based on factors like salary, playing time, awards, and honors. How many of the guys in the Carolina Panthers roster who are about to be free agents are going to be in the top 35% of NFL players? If it's one of the worst rosters in the NFL, and this roster has 30 pending free agents, how many of them are really going to count towards the compensatory formula? That's something to understand. Now, last year, the Panthers, they lost 4 CFAs while they added 9. The guys that they lost were Frankie Louvu to Washington, who would have yielded a 5th-round pick, which is not that great. Yetur Gross-Matos, who would have yielded a 6th-round pick. Jeremy Chin, who would have yielded a 6th-round pick. And then this one was surprising. Shaquille Griffin, who would have yielded a 6th-round pick. So the Panthers had 4 guys leave, but then brought in 9. That cancels it out. Go back to other years, like the year prior, the Panthers had 1 player who was a CFA. That player was Sam Darnold. They would have got back a 7th-round pick, but instead they added 6 players that were also CFAs during the offseason. So the thing is, Carolina has guys who are eligible to give them back a compensatory pick. The problem, though, they signed a ton of free agents. And when you look at this, if you got 30 free agents leaving, you only have 9 draft picks right now. 30 free agents leaving, you're not going to be able to replace all of them via the draft. They're going to have to sign other players, and that potentially, if that other player is also a CFA, is going to cancel things out and make it difficult for them to get comp picks. Now, look over the last couple of years. So this upcoming draft, they lost 4 last offseason, gained 9, not getting 1. Prior to that, like I mentioned, it was only Darnold. They brought in 6 players. Prior to that, they lost 3 CFAs, gained 4. The year before that, they lost 3 CFAs, gained 8. The last time where they were able to get comp picks was during the 2021 NFL draft. Go back to the offseason of 2020. I remember the Roaring Riot made t-shirts of I survived the offseason of 2020, where Cam Newton left, Luke Kuechly retired, Greg Olsen went to Seattle. We saw Mario Addison leave to go to Buffalo. A bunch of players. James Bradbury left to go to New York. That's when they lost a ton of guys, especially on the defensive side of the ball. They lost 7 CFAs that year. 7. The Panthers have only had 8 over the last 3 offseasons leave town. They had 7 leave in 1 offseason, which just shows you the talent drain that is here on the roster right now. So 7 that year, and they gained 5. Bruce Irvin and Darrell Williams were the 2 guys that left. They ended up yielding 6th-round picks. So not necessarily high draft picks, but you can always trade those away, use them to bring in more players, obviously. And in 2020, they lost 2, gained 3. So this is a team that over the last couple of years, going all the way back to 2020, has lost 20 players that were deemed as compensatory free agents and brought in 35. They have not had a lot of talent leave the building, which also means they have not really, and there has been talent that's left the building via trade, like McCaffrey, like DJ Moore, like Brian Burns. But as far as guys just walking away and having that kind of talent, hasn't been a ton of them over the last couple of seasons, which kind of speaks to why the Panthers have been among one of the worst franchises in the NFL the last couple of years, all the way dating back to that 2020 season when Matt Rule first took over. It really goes back to 2019 when you look at 2020, or I guess 2019. But that's kind of what it is, man. They're not losing a ton of dudes, and they're bringing in a lot of players every offseason via free agency because they feel like they have to rebuild their team every year. And there was always that philosophy of, all right, let's bring these guys in because we got to be competitive, got to find a way to win the NFC South division that had seemed to be in flux over the last couple of years. Of course, there were the years of Brady recently, and of course, with Drew Brees towards the end of his career. But the Panthers have really just tried to build their team via free agency. So, yeah, I guess in theory, it would make sense to decide to just let a guy walk. But if you can possibly, and it goes all the way to a 4th-round pick you can get as far as comp picks go, just want to double check that as I pull up over the cap.com, that you can get up to a 3rd-round pick. So players that got teams 3rd-round picks this past year or for next year, because it's offseason 2024, it'll go to 2025 draft. The players that were able to yield a 3rd-round pick: Kirk Cousins leaving Minnesota to go to Atlanta, Christian Wilkins leaving Miami to go to the Raiders, Robert Hunt leaving Miami to come here to Carolina. And I think a big part of that is obviously playing time, but the contract he was given. Same thing with Cousins and Wilkins. Raheem Morris, not a player, but a coach. The Rooney Rule going to the Falcons from LA. And then kind of same thing, D'Amico Ryans, Ryan Carthon, both of those guys leaving San Francisco to go over to be the Texans head coach and then the Titans general manager, respectively. So they can get a 3rd-round pick. That player, though, has to get paid a ton. Had they let Brian Burns walk, he would have been valued as a 3rd-round pick, but they would not have gotten it. So I understand that, okay, we can get a comp pick for that player, but there's a formula involved, and it depends on how many of those top 35% CFA kind of players you bring in and how many you lose. And the Panthers have been bringing in a lot and not losing very many, which therein lies the problem where they're not able to get those comp picks. So you can guarantee yourself getting some compensation by trading a player right now. Now, will that be the best return? I don't know. But as far as banking on comp picks, based off the last couple of off seasons, wouldn't do it. All right, so we'll take one more quick pause here, come back, and we'll talk about what the Panthers do. How do they rebuild this thing? And here's the easy answer: the draft. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And speaking of bets, let's go ahead and look at it over on FanDuel again, as we have been doing the last couple of days. Carolina Panthers are now 9.5-point underdogs. Is that the line changing because Bryce Young's going to start? It was at 7.5. It was at 8.5 yesterday. Now they are 9.5-point underdogs to the Denver Broncos, plus 400 money line. And it's got to be because of Bryce Young. It's just got to be because people do not believe. But I know some of y'all still believe. I would love to believe as well it could work out for him. Don't think it's going to work out for him here, but possibly. This is where everything turns around. The over-under is also set at 42.5. You get started with $200 bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. One final question here on the weekly Wednesday mailbag here on Locked On Panthers comes over from Todd, and had a couple of people ask this similar question, and really only 3 questions this week because a lot of y'all asked similar questions, and these 3 really made me think, and I had to put together a lot of notes as far as that. So sometimes it'll be weeks like this where I did get a decent amount, but 3 of them really stood out to me. I want to spend some time on them, but please keep sending them in. I went back and tried to answer all the questions that y'all sent to me via my DMs or added me at Julian Council over on Twitter. So do that. Get those questions in for next week. I'll always get to them, maybe not on the show, but I'll try to get to them at least there on Twitter. So Todd asking about where do we go from here? Where can the Panthers honestly go from here? Do we embrace a full rebuild? We have little draft capital and very few players that would draw significant interest. Do we tear everything down, minus Derek Brown, J.C. Horn, and a new rookie class? And, well, the answer of where do we go from here is the draft. The Panthers have to draft better, have to draft a bunch of young players, get them go out there in the field, produce, then keep them around. That's how you build a winning team, not by going out there and signing 9 compensatory free agents and 6 and 4 and 8. That's not how you win. By having 35 guys over the last 6 offseasons come in that are considered compensatory free agents, that's not how you win games in the NFL. You win games in the NFL by going out there, drafting well, developing your players, rewarding the guys that you drafted and developed, and making shrewd business decisions when it comes to trades. That's how you win games. But this is a team that has whiffed on trades, has whiffed on the draft, and has not kept around those guys who have come in here and have developed and played well and have been deserving of a contract. Some of them gotten paid, of course, but they have also been traded away later on. There is the issue for Carolina. Looking in 2025, you say the Panthers don't have much draft capital. They have 9 picks in this upcoming draft. They have their own first. They have LA's second, which looks like it's going to be a pretty high pick. They're in the second round, like the Panthers pick, which they do not have. It's owned by the Giants. Their own third, their own fourth, their own fifth. They have the Giants fifth from the Brian Burns trade, their own sixth. And then in the 7th round, they're going to have 2 picks, either their own 7th, unless it's lower than Arizona's, or Arizona's 7th, unless it's lower than Carolina's. That goes back to the Robbie Chosen Anderson, whatever the hell his name is, trade a couple years ago. The Chiefs will get the higher of the 2 7s, but only one of them. So the Panthers will either have Arizona's or their own, and they'll also have Kansas City's from, I can't remember what trade there was made then. So that's 9 picks in the draft coming up. The Panthers have not had that many picks since back in 2021, Scott Fitterer's first draft, where they went in with, I believe, 6 picks and came out with 11 players. Now, the last 2 drafts after that Fitterer was in charge of, 22 and 23, he only drafted 11 total players. Now, we look at those draft classes and, oh boy, what a disappointment those guys have turned out to be. Going back to 2021, J.C. Horn has been the only one that's been really a marquee player for the Panthers, but he has dealt with injuries, not this season so far. Knock on wood. Terrace Marshall Jr., no longer here. Brady Christensen was a backup, now the starting center. Hard to believe he's going to have a future in Carolina. We'll see. He's got an opportunity right now and actually has played well, so we'll see. Tommy Trimble, he's been banged up this year. New staff, new general manager who is also around. I have no idea whether he's going to be around. Chuba Hubbard, been outstanding. We'll see what they do there. Davion Nixon, no longer here. Keith Taylor, no longer here. Deontay Brown, no longer here. Shai Smith, no longer here. Thomas Fletcher, never even made it. And Phil Hoskins, no longer here. Only one of these players from the 2021 draft class, which really was the draft class that could have been transformative under Scott Fitterer and set the Panthers' foundation for years to come. That class has one player who is guaranteed to be on the roster next year, just via contract. I would say he's under contract. Only one player under contract next year, and that is J.C. Horn. That's terrible. That 1 out of 11 players is under contract for next season, and that they could not figure things out as far as those guys. And even the guys that are at least in limbo, like Christensen, Trimble, Hubbard, you cannot say with absolute certainty and confidence that they will be on the roster next season. Go to 2022. Ike Ekwonu, starting left tackle. Think he's been fine so far this season. We'll see whether the Panthers still feel like he's going to be a franchise left tackle, have a big decision to make after this year with the 5th-year option. Matt Corral, not in the league. Brandon Smith, I think on a practice squad somewhere. Murray Barno, currently on PUP, but hasn't really been an impact player. Cade Mays was cut. Now he's back as a backup. Kalen Barnes never made the team, so that class is no good. Bryce Young was benched. Now back at being the starter. Will he go back to the bench? We'll find out. Mingo's been awful. DJ Johnson's been awful. Chandler Zavala has actually looked much better this year when he's gotten opportunities, but still a backup. And the Panthers paying a lot of money to both their guards and Damian Lewis and Robert Hunt. So it's not like he has much of a future under this current regime. Jamie Robinson has done nothing. So that's 3 straight nothing burgers out of draft classes by Scott Fitterer. So the draft is how they're going to do it, man. And they got to hit on these picks. You got a lot of guys leaving. And you're going to have to go out and be aggressive in free agency to a certain extent. I looked at something where they only have like $40 million of cap space. It's not like they have a ton heading into next season. Let me go to overthecap.com as I'm here live with y'all right. And we're not live as I'm recording this. And it says they have $41 million projected cap space next season. For a team as bad as the Panthers, you would expect them to have a hell of a lot more cap space than they have going into next year. The thing is, cap space is great. How you use it is what matters. And you can't just use it all the time, just on these high-priced free agents and all that. You got to be able to draft well. So how do they get out of this mess? They take the 9 picks they had this year, and they hopefully get more picks by trading some players here before the deadline or maybe in the offseason, and they go out there and they bring in a haul of young players, and they get the right ones with the right mentality, right attitude, and they're able to develop them and let those guys hit. Not every single one is going to hit. If we bring in 13 players, Carolina really needs it to be where like 6 of them, 7 of them really come in and be impact players for them that can start, that can be out there. And then of those, like 4 are able to be retained and be foundations moving forward, because it's difficult. Salary cap league. I know people want to say cap doesn't exist. It does exist. So that's how they get this mess. 9 picks going to the draft, a chance the next couple of weeks to actually get more of those picks. You got to hit on them. You got to hit on them. You got to develop them. And that's how they do it, man, because you look at those 3 drafts, the ones that Fitter had, whiff after whiff after whiff after whiff after whiff. And that's why we're right here, man. And I hate to say it, but that's just the case here in Carolina. That's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast for our Locked On Podcast Network. Host by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all, thanks for watching the show here on YouTube and listening wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Subscribe if you have not already, if you are watching this right now on YouTube and wherever you're listening to it right now. Check me out, Julian Council, on Twitter at Julian Council. We're here on Wednesday. I answer your weekly Wednesday mailbag questions either at me or DM me to get those questions into me right now, or not now, but after the game on Sunday, where there should be plenty of conversation and questions since Bryce Young will be starting in that game. But in the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole as always, and forever keep pounding. And on tomorrow's show is a Locked On NFL Crossover Thursday brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks. Me talking to Sarah Bettinger, one of the 2 hosts of Locked On Broncos.